Good morning, everyone. This is Gail Kislevitz, and today we will be speaking with Amby Burfoot for the Theodore Corbett Institute of Running collection of pioneer history runners. So I want to first introduce you to Amby. Amby Burfoot is the quintessential New England runner. He was born in Groton, Connecticut, and ran cross country at Fitch High School under the legendary coach John J. Kelly the Younger, winner of the 1957 Boston Marathon and a member of the 1956 and 1960 U.S. Olympic Marathon team. He took Amby under his wing and a lifelong mentorship was formed. Amby went on to attend Wesleyan College in Connecticut, where his teammates were Bill Rogers and the late Jeff Galloway. In 1968, his senior year, he won the Boston Marathon. Later that year, at the Fukuoka Marathon in Japan, he ran a personal best time of 2 hours and 14 minutes, which was just 1 second off the American record at that time. Amby was also publisher of Runner's World magazine for more than 20 years, where he interviewed more runners, both celebrity and your everyday variety, than any other journalist known. And he has lots of stories to tell. So I'm going to turn it over to Amby to discuss how and when he intersected with the New York scene of running. Hi, Amby.
Hi, Gail. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
So we have a lot of things to cover today. Lots of questions, and a lot of the questions and what we're going to talk about covers both the early New York Roadrunner days and the whole New England Boston days, because there is a lot of intersection. Because when we're talking about the 60s, there really was no other place to be or go if you wanted to race. And I remember Ted Corbett telling me in the 60s he would just jump in a car in New York with his buddies, drive up to Boston, run the marathon, and turn around and drive back because that's what you did. There was also carloads of New York Roadrunner members like Fred and Catherine Switzer and Nina Cusick, who used to jump in a bus and come up to some of the races here in New London. The what is now known as the John Kelly half marathon. Back then it was a 11.1 mile race, and they used to come up and run, and there was so much crossover between Boston and New York. And I want to hear about that.
Is that a question?
Yes, it is a direct question. Tell us stories.
Well, I can tell you that in my early days in running, we did, in fact, all in New York and in Mystic, Connecticut, have to jump in a car and drive for hours to get to a road race. And I remember road races one weekend in New York City, the next weekend going the opposite way to the end of Cape Cod, and the third weekend driving north into New Hampshire or Portland, Maine, or wherever that weekend's race was. So, one of the biggest changes in road racing after all this time is that we have to put a lot less mileage onto our car to get to a road race on a given weekend. And of course, that's a wonderful development.
Yes, it is. Now, let's talk first about some of the venues that were in New York at the time: Van Cortlandt Park, Yonkers, the Yonkers Marathon, which again was, iconic. You had to run Yonkers if you wanted to be considered for the Olympics. The Cherry Tree Marathon, the New York City Marathon. Were you ever a part of those races?
Well, let's start with my first interaction with the New York Roadrunners or Roadrunners Club, as it was known back then. I would have been, now I got to think back, a high school, going into my senior year in high school, I believe. I got an address for the New York Roadrunners Club and said if I sent them a self-addressed stamped envelope, they would send me a list of the summer road race and cross country opportunities in the city. So I did so, and much to my surprise, the letter came back to me. And not only that, but it had a scrawled kind of "Hello, welcome, come try one of our races" out from Joe Kleinerman. So
Oh,
my first meeting with the New York Roadrunners was through Joe Kleinerman, and I believe probably that summer my father drove me to one summer 5K road race, not road race, cross country race in Van Cortlandt Park. So that would have been the very, very first time that I ran in New York City. I ran another 3 or 4 times. I have to admit, Gail, that at this age, people were shoving me in a car. I was not about to drive to New York City, even though I might have had a driver's license then. But the truth is, I was shoved in a car. We drove for a couple of hours. The car door opened. I didn't know where we were. I had no idea what borough of New York City we might be in or anything else. I had no landmarks in New York City. And we got out of the car and somebody pushed us rather bedraggled after a couple of hours of driving to a start line, and we took off and ran 15K or 20K or whatever it was. At that time, I belonged to an actually very, very strong road running club from New Britain, Connecticut. It was called the Central Connecticut AA. And one of our members was Jim Keep, who was actually quite briefly the American record holder for the 6 mile run in the 60s. So he was national to world class almost. He could run a 401 mile, which back in those days for a road runner was pretty darn quick.
yeah, because we're
We had
talking
another runner.
1965, that type, that era, if you're a senior
We're
in high
talk
school.
we're talking that era or my one of my first or second years at Wesleyan. Another teammate named Ray Crothers, who was a New England cross country champ. And then I was the third runner on the team. So we had three runners who were more or less national class, if you will. So there were actually 1 or 2 times when we went down to New York City and beat the legendary teams named Milrose or New York AC or whatever else they were. So we were pretty proud of ourselves. It was a heady era, and it was a lot of fun to go to the big city and run against people we didn't see every weekend, like the Boston runners.
But did you know of them? Was their running fame, did it spread up to New? Did you know what you were getting into when you came down to these races? Oh, these are the New York runners.
Yeah, we knew because even before Runner's World, there were various small running publications, and I was a very avid reader of those magazines. They weren't magazines, they were little stapled booklets named Long Distance Log and things like that. So I knew names ranging from, let's see who comes to mind, Ted Corbett, of course, Gary Murke, Jim McDonough, Norv Sander, of course, John Garlep. I remember at a lot of races. Uh, who am I forgetting? I'm forgetting lots, I'm
That's all
sure,
right. We can
but I
name the
knew.
top ones.
Yeah, I knew them by name and not by face. I did get to know them, especially Ted, who traveled quite far and wide, and who was, let's say, rather unique because he was one of the few black road runners of the time. And we all knew that he was both an Olympian and an ultra marathon star. And the notion of running ultra marathons, the distances Ted was running was just astonishing in that age. So we all wanted to know that everything that Ted had learned about running.
Did you ever have a conversation with Ted, or did you ever race in the same race with him and got to see how he ran?
I remember Ted's running form very, very well because it was not elegant. I would see him, I suppose, in out and back courses. That was a time when I was getting better quite dramatically. And Ted was past his peak, so he was not winning road races at that time, but might be anywhere from fifth to 15th or 20th. And we'd see each other running. And I remember with great embarrassment the time that I screwed up all my courage to ask him if it was more difficult to be a black road runner than a white runner because of the black skin absorbing heat into your body. And we all knew heat was an enemy of good performance. And he answered very simply that he didn't think so. He didn't know. I'm still not sure if anyone has ever studied that question. Ted, of course, was not a big talker. He was so quiet, and I was young and quiet myself. So we didn't have long, involved conversations, but his story, his legend loomed very, very large over everything in New York and road running at that time.
Yeah, as it should. He was legendary and quiet, and polite, so he never would have, looked at you like, "Why are you asking me that question?" Um, what about the Cherry Tree Marathon? Did you ever come down to run that one?
I came down to Cherry Tree once, must have been with John Kelly. I believe it was 1966, and Gary Corbett was the one who helped me pinpoint that. And all I really remember, again, was I didn't know where we were. There was this place that I've read about called McCombs Dam Park, and I knew Yankee Stadium was there and nearby. But when I was running, all I remember that one day at Cherry Tree was it was a February race or midwinter. It was freezing rain. It was probably 35 degrees and torrential rain. Everybody's candidate for the worst possible running conditions. And I would like to see the DNF percentage from that race because I quit halfway through it. And when I got back to the locker room looking for warmth, pretty much everyone else in the race was in the locker room also swearing about the conditions. So that was a tough one, but I did go down and run it, and I believe I also ran Yonkers 1 month after my first Boston, which would have been spring of 65. So a month after running Boston, where I was 25th overall and about 235. I went to Yonkers because that's what Kelly did every year. He did the double Boston and Yonkers. And I would have to look up where I finished at Yonkers. I'm sure the time was very slow. Probably I finished in the second five or so, just because I legged it out over the 26 miles and finished. I do remember the finish on the track, and I do remember the incredible hills and the toughness of that course in Yonkers.
Yeah, that's what it was known for. It was a tough course, but everyone had to run it. And the same thing with Cherry Tree. I mean, that was brutal. It was always February. It was run sometimes on the roads, on a highway. And that's probably one of the reasons it didn't last as long as it might have, because it was a brutal, brutal marathon. But everyone ran it, as you said. Gary Murphy ran it. Everybody from New York Roadrunners ran it. Um, I don't think Nina ever ran that one, but we would laugh about McCombs Dam Park, and she would just always say the Dam Park. She wouldn't even say McCombs.
I do remember that it felt like running on a highway. I remember that there were
You were.
cars that looked like derelict, abandoned cars parked on the side of the road. I don't know if they were or not. And I only ran it once, so I never got to run it on a nice February day, if there's anything like
I
that.
think that it
Uh, but I suspect New York runners used it as a quote unquote tune up for Boston a couple of months later.
could be, could be. Now, did you ever run in Van Cortlandt Park?
Yeah, I ran a lot in Van Cortlandt, or relatively a lot in Van Cortlandt. Of course, it was one of, if not the most famous cross country course in the country. At least at that time it was, because of its historic nature. And what's the hill in Fanny called? Cardiac Hill? The hill is called something. If not Heartbreak, it's something. And I ran as a junior and senior at Wesleyan in the IC4A championships at Van Cortlandt. And because Wesleyan was a small school, I wasn't allowed to run against the faster runners from, you know, Villanova and Georgetown and Fordham and all the good schools. I had to run alone by myself against small school runners, and I tended to win those races by a healthy margin because I just happened to be very fit then. So I would have to compare my times with the times of the guys in the next race running from Villanova. And usually I was right about at the same finish time as they were, 24, 25 sticks in my mind. So that made me feel good.
Is that because your school was in a different division, so you couldn't run with them?
Yeah, we were in Division 2 and they were considered Division 1, or there was some other qualification, large school and small school. At any rate, we ran separately, and I suppose that was meant to protect us from getting crushed by the big guys. Of course, I would have preferred to have the opportunity to measure myself against the best that we had, but I was lucky to run well a couple of times at Van Cortlandt.
Yeah, I think John used to tell me that the Olympic team used to come down and use Van Cortlandt as a training ground before they went off because it just had great running.
It would have been a great place, and you could have done hill work as well as running on the flats, so
Yeah.
had a bit of everything.
Yeah, and it still does. It's a great venue. What about Madison Square Garden? Did you ever run in there? I mean, I know you're not really a track guy, but
I was not ever a track guy, but when I was in college, my senior year, 3 months before I won Boston, I just happened to be fit and running well. And the first race of the year was an indoor meet in Boston, and there was only six of us in the race, and two of them fell on the first lap. So then there was only four of us, and I had no choice but to stick with the other guys. So I ran an 8:45 2 mile, which I thought was incredible. I had never dreamed I could run that far under 9 minutes. And then the big Milrose games at Madison Square Garden came up a couple of weeks later. And it was an Olympic year, so they ran a 3 mile, like the 5,000 meter Olympic distance. We ran a 3 mile in Madison Square Garden, which meant 11 laps of that track. And I was really psyched that I was going to get an extra mile to put the screws to everybody with my marathoning, long distance endurance approach to running. And also, it was televised because nothing else was televised in those days from the indoor scene. But Milrose was on national TV, so I told all my friends to tune in and watch me run 33 laps around Madison Square Garden. And what actually happened was I led the race for 31 laps, and then everybody passed me in the last two laps because they were much faster than me. And the TV broadcast showed only the last two laps of the race, so I didn't even get onto TV and
oh,
make my national debut. But it was quite an experience to run a big race like that.
I bet. Well, you've run in all the big venues, all of them.
I ran in the New England venues, of course, and at the collegiate championships in the late 60s when I was at Wesleyan, whether it was cross country. One year was Kansas, and the next year it was Laramie, Wyoming, where it was about 25 degrees. And we were all, the whole world was getting ready for the 1968 Mexico City Olympics at altitude. No one had ever run at altitude. There had never been an altitude Olympics before. So they sent us to lots of races in Utah and BYU and places like that for us to find out if altitude was a real thing. And what I remember is we mostly scoffed about it. We didn't really believe altitude was a real thing
Ooh.
until we actually had to run a race. Then we found out the hard way it was a substantial obstacle and really needed some specific training to get ready for.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how the sport grew in the 60s and the 70s, both in Boston and New York, because you've got some real strong characters here. You've got Jock Semple and Will Clooney up in Boston. You've got Fred down in New York. You've got Bill Squires and Tom Dodarian, all these people, great runners who really did want to grow the sport. And they did in both areas. Do you see any difference of how they came together to grow the sport, both in New York and Boston? The personalities, did they all work together, or did they have separate agendas?
Well, everybody was, of course, involved in the sport because they were passionate about long distance running and specifically road racing. Once we get to that, which is what we're talking about mostly. But the sport was very, very regional then, and Boston and New York, while Ted and a few people traveled to both venues, and I traveled a few times to both. They were very, very different scenes, and they had different characters. And half of the people you just mentioned were the actual road race directors. Perhaps they were AAU officials back in those horrible AAU days, which haven't gotten much better through the years. But these are the people who had the responsibility and energy to put on road racing programs. And specifically, they would try and have championships over the standard distances 10K, 15K, 20K. There was no half marathon then. You'd even find the occasional 25K, which is pretty hard to find now. So these guys put on races. We all knew them. There were only 45 or 50 runners in a race. So you kind of knew almost
Yeah.
everyone. And you certainly knew not only Jock Semple, who was famous for his work with the Boston Marathon, the most famous race by far, but you knew the other guys who were putting on the smaller races in Holyoke, Massachusetts, or Boston, or Northern New England, or Cape Cod. There were different people in each location, and everybody put on a couple of races a year that seemed to start and finish at Elks Home or American Legion or VFW. To this day, I don't know what those groups do, but that's where we ran all of our races out of their basement beer halls and locker rooms. And it was just a scene. You can't imagine it today. Just seeing the same people every weekend. Everybody would show up at a race, and you immediately knew, oh, I'm going to finish fifth today. There are four guys here who are faster than me. Not much I can do about it. I can run my butt off, but I'm still going to finish fifth. Or if you got lucky, not so many people showed up, and maybe you were going to finish second or third.
And we still do that today. I mean, even in our age group, we're like, oh, that 80-year-old showed up, he's gonna beat me.
You know, what you just said, the age group scene today was kind of like what the whole of running was back in the old days, because you've got a relatively small number of people in your age group who you got to eyeball to see if they showed up or not. And that's how New England road running was. And Hal Higdon wrote a very, very famous story for Sports Illustrated that became a book later, and the chapter title was, "Has anyone here seen Kelly?" Because if Kelly was at the race, you weren't going to win it. But if Kelly wasn't at the race, then you could
You
rub
had
your
a
hands
chance.
together greedily, and maybe you'd win a blender or a new pair of tires or a toaster for your kitchen if Kelly wasn't there. If he was there, you might as well give up and go home.
Yeah, and you showed up to win. That's all. I mean, that's what everybody wanted to do was win. There was no, oh, I'll just finish like there is now. Everyone thought they had a
Well,
chance.
Yeah, it's funny. I had this discussion with someone recently who believes that in the old days we used to race against each other and try and beat each other. And I was not really that person. I didn't care if I won or not. Well, all I wanted to do was to see if I could get 100% out of myself in the race that I was running. So sometimes I got 100% and I won, and that was great. And sometimes I got 101% and I finished seventh. And that was even better because the goal was to see how I could improve myself. So I went to races to run hard. I went to races for competition because competition helped me run harder. But in the end, talking about winning, it's fun now and it was fun then. But the real quest for me at least was to see how good I could be against myself. I was running against my own potential.
It's funny because I keep thinking of Tom Fleming, who was of that era, and his favorite quote was, "If I'm not out training today, someone's going to beat me." It was all about winning.
Well, yeah, I remember that also, and I remember what a fierce competitor Tom was, particularly at the marathon distance where he would just go out hard and dare everyone to match him.
Mhm.
Um, and I certainly trained hard because I knew others were training hard. There was a bit of the doing well at races, but I still contend it was really just to see what I could get out of myself more than anything else. It was a personal challenge.
Well, I think that's a lot more important, especially if you want to stay in the sport, which you have.
Well, yeah, I mean, fortunately now we have all these statistical tricks like age graded scoring and whatnot, and we can a little bit compare ourselves with our former selves through those calculations. The older I get, the more I'm running, I guess, for the what I hope is the physical health, but even more the mental health, because I know that I do feel better mentally on days when I'm running or days when I'm fit and active than days when I'm not. So that's really what keeps me going now.
That's a good goal. So let's move on and talk about Doc Charlie Robbins. Did you know him?
Oh, everybody in Connecticut knew Charlie. Charlie was just everybody's number one favorite runner for a number of reasons. The first, I guess, was that he was largely a barefoot runner, and we he ran barefoot in road races around Connecticut and New England. He had some kind of rule like you run barefoot if the temperature's above 45 degrees. If it's 35 or 45 to 45, you put on a pair of socks. And if it's below freezing, you wear the lightest pair of shoes you can possibly find because a cold road just felt hard and painful. But otherwise, he ran barefoot. And he was a psychiatrist in Middletown, Connecticut, the home of Wesleyan University. So he would show up at cross country practice and track practice at Wesleyan every Wednesday afternoon. All the other doctors took their Wednesday afternoon off to go golfing. And Doc came to practice at Wesleyan. And, you know, in the early days, this was a guy who had about 2% body fat. He was wiry and strong. We had this big, thick rope in the Wesleyan field house, we called it. It went all the way up to the ceiling, and Doc could grab the rope and just go boom, 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 boom up to the top. I'd get about three hands up and collapse to the ground. So he just had this incredible wiry strength. He had the simplest approach to running you could possibly have. He felt that doing a few hard sprints and a couple of miles at a time was pretty much enough to keep you in shape. He had a couple of Boston marathons where he finished fifth or sixth, even though he didn't really train for that. And Doc, at his best, could run very close to 50 minutes for 10 miles in a New England road race. So he won a lot of New England races in the era just before John Kelly. He was more the early 50s.
Hmm. And there was a famous 100-mile relay between the New York Pioneer Club and the BAA. Did John or Doc ever talk about that or tell stories about that?
You know, that's one of the questions that Gary Corbett also asked me. I don't know anything about that event. It certainly was not one that my team or my friends knew about. And if it was a Boston, New York competition, it was between those guys, and Mystic, Connecticut was not the center of that universe.
No, no. All right. So do you recall a runner for the BAA named Gonzalez Scotto?
I don't remember that name. There were ethnic runners with the BAA and more with the New York Road Runners. And, you know, there were interesting people Sigmund Podlosny, who had one arm. He was a New England fixture, and we saw him everywhere. And there were other back of the Packers even then, who we loved completely because of the fact that they would show up at every race and finish last or next to last and be completely happy with it. And we were happy for them. But Mystic is not, where I grew up, is not an ethnic community. Wesleyan was a little bit more so in the early days. Wesleyan was ahead of most schools at having a diverse student body. But you have to remember there were so few road runners back then
Yeah.
that the fact that a certain community wasn't overly represented didn't mean too much because nobody was represented
Right.
in road running except for us skinny freaks.
Yeah, it's the same with women. They were not represented either. And
Of
if they were, they
course.
were thrown out of races. Um, so all right, let's move on and talk about one of your favorite races, the Manchester Road Race, which started in what, 1927? And you hold the record for the most consecutive runs.
I hold the record for the most consecutive runs at Manchester, and I don't remember the number, but my first one was 64, and my last one was 25. You add 1 year to that, 62 in a row, I believe would be the answer. And for a long time, I thought there were other people who had longer streaks than me at other races. But in the last year or so, as I've researched it, I found out that their streaks were not continuous because their races were stopped during World War II, which is
Oh,
when this one fellow had a very, very impressive streak in San Francisco. So I think 62 is actually the longest road race streak that anybody has ever run. I don't know what that means other than I'm steady and obstinate and determined, and I get back there, and I have certainly had to run it with obstacles through the years because everybody has something happened, and I've had stuff happen that I wish didn't, but it did, and I had to keep running anyway at Manchester. And I was also, in the early days, again, I was successful. It was Connecticut's biggest race. It was the second biggest race in New England after the Boston Marathon. So if you ran Boston in April and Manchester in November, that was a pretty good double for the year. I did win it a lot of years in my 20s, and that was very, very exciting. And now the Boston Marathon means a lot to me, but in some way, going back to Manchester because I have the unbroken streak there. That's at least as important as running Boston because I like streaks. I'd like to see how long I can keep this one going. I won't do it as a walker. I won't do it if I have something terrible knocks me out of the game. But if I just slow down a little bit more, which I've been doing for 60 years, then that's okay. We all slow down with age.
true. And that race is very near and dear to your heart. I think I read that you first ran it as a senior at Wesleyan.
I ran it as a senior in high school.
Oh, in high
I
school.
won.
Right.
Yes, Kelly took me up there, of course, because he had won it, what, 5 times. And I won the high school division, and then I won the open race a lot of times. And I always thought would have been nice if I had won the Masters division too, but I didn't. My friend Ray Crothers is the only one who won all three divisions. But then later in my 60s, I won my age group division a couple of times. I haven't completely flopped, but I'm getting close.
Did you see any of the New York runners come up to Manchester? You know, the big New York
No,
runners? No, they didn't come.
no, it's really a Hartford suburban race, and it's the race. All races are like this in terms of nothing happens until an hour before the race, and then the runners flood into town, and then nothing happens, and then an hour after the race, you're back to quietude again. But at Manchester, because it's Thanksgiving, it just heightens that.
Mhm.
And literally, there's nothing going on the streets of Manchester at 9 o'clock in the morning or 8:30. And then 15,000 people descend on the town from nearby communities, and they park on the highway and all sorts of places they're not supposed to park. But who's really going to bother them for an hour or two? Thanksgiving morning, they run the race. Nobody stays around for a minute after finishing. Well, a few go to a local bar and party, but everybody else gets in the car and goes home to enjoy family festivities with their larger group at home. So it's an instantaneous road race, but that's the nature of Thanksgiving. And
Mhm.
Thanksgiving, as you probably know, is the biggest running day in
Yeah,
America. So this tradition is repeated everywhere across the country. It's become something quite special.
it is. Everybody has a turkey trot in their own hometown.
There's a turkey trot everywhere.
There is. You had mentioned to me a story about Greta, and I know you were pretty close to Greta. You interviewed her many times, and she was just such a lovely woman. And you shared a story about her running, I guess, her third New York City Marathon, where you got together with Kenny Moore and Don Cardone to interview her or something along the race.
To actually run with her. But now I'm thinking the better story was the first year that she showed up at New York. I'll try and tell that one quickly. Those of us who followed road racing and not so much European track really didn't know much about Greta. Our shame, our fault. When she first came to New York City, and of course she won the first year right away with a world record time or whatever she did, and so she was a huge sensation. And here I was, the writer for Runner's World, so I figured, I got to get this story. I've got to find out who this woman is. Somehow I figured out or knew that she was staying at the Mayflower Hotel, and I called and I got connected with her room, and I timidly asked if I could come up and interview her to find out her full story. Of course, I expected she'd slam the phone on the handle, and that would be the last I'd ever hear from Greta. But she said, no, sure, come up. So I went up to the room. It looked exactly like every other Roadrunner's room where someone had been there for 4 or 5 days, just clothes strewn everywhere, damp clothes drying out over the chairs and the heaters and the lampposts, and just looked like your room or my room or anybody else's
Destroyed.
after a few days. And she spoke good English. In the early years, you had to go a little bit slow with her, but she answered every question very carefully, not a lot of detail, certainly didn't make herself out to be anything special. She was getting calls from her principal back in Oslo wanting to know what was going on. She said, they want me to stay here for the Today Show. And he was like, what's the Today Show? And she was like, I don't know, but they think it's important that I go on the Today Show. So she got permission to stay an extra day, and Jack was with her, of course. And they were just so easygoing. I was just so incredulous that they would let someone into their room and talk about running endlessly as I wanted to do.
Uh,
So that was year one. 2 years later, the three of us, Kenny Moore, Don Cardong, and I decided, well, she sets a world record every time she runs New York. Why don't we run with her and write a first person story about seeing a world record in the setting? What is that? What will that be like? Kenny Moore learns that Don Cardong and I are doing it, and he decides he doesn't want to be the another spoke on the wheel. So he just writes a traditional story. Don, for some reason, started with her at the women's start. I guess there were two bridges and two starts in those days. I can barely remember that.
top and bottom
And
level.
yeah, and I thought, well, I'm a guy. I should start on the guys' start. And then when we merge in Brooklyn, I'm going to have to go looking for her, and that'll be sort of part of the story, and that'll be fun. So I ran from the guys' start and found her somewhere in Brooklyn after a few miles, and we all ran together. And Don was not too far from his Olympic years, so he didn't have any trouble running with Greta, but I was a lot of years from my best. So I did have trouble, and she dumped me at about
Ah,
23 miles, which I thought was totally appropriate because there she was going for another world record. So we all got our stories, and before long, of course, she was the queen of New York City, and everybody knew Greta and admired her both for her running ability, which was incredible, and even more so for her personality, which was just so low key and easy and non ostentatious.
yeah, she was a gracious and warm woman to everybody. One more funny story before I let you go, and this involves with Fred Lebo, and you tried to get him on the cover of Runner's World with the race director from Chicago, Fred, no, Wright, Bob Wright.
Upright.
What happened?
Yeah. So in the, I guess it was in the 80s, the Chicago Marathon got their race going a little bit. And then it built up more, and they got some money, and they started bringing in elite athletes. And guess what? Chicago is flat, New York is hilly. So people run a lot faster in Chicago than they do in New York. And that gets you some headlines. So suddenly it was like Chicago and New York were in competition to be the biggest, best fall marathon. And I thought, great, I'm the editor at Runner's World. We should do some kind of really outrageous, interesting story about the competition between Chicago and New York. And my idea was that I'd get the two race directors to line up as if they were back to back with each other with guns raised, as if they were about to face off in a duel like
Oh,
Alexander
West.
Hamilton and yeah, the guys back in the early pioneer days or something. And Bob Wright was into it because he would do anything for publicity. And Fred, I got Fred really close to the edge, but finally in the end he said no, he wouldn't do it, which surprised me because Fred was known for his publicity stunts and
Yeah.
usually carried them off well. I think it would have been a really fun cover to do. Maybe I can reproduce it with AI illustrations now,
That would be
but
fun.
didn't get them onto the cover of Runner's World in a duel to the death and a competition between their marathons. But they both made good coverage and good press. So we liked them both at Runner's World.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that when Chicago first came on the scene, there might have been some feeling of competition from the other marathons because there weren't that many. And now every marathon is like 50,000 people. You can't even get into them. And it's just so funny to see the past and where we are now.
Well, exactly. The history of marathoning and the boom, which seems to be booming greater than ever right now, it's an evolution, but it's a really fast evolution. You can historically, I think, call it a revolution in running and marathoning. And as you said, the problem now is you can't get into the big marathons. It's an issue for the marathons themselves because it's not good for a business, and they're all businesses. It's not good to be turning away 95% of your customers. But what can they do? They can only put so many people on the roads, and there are hundreds of thousands who want to get in. So it's an interesting question to consider.
It is. It is. But what's more important is to have the perspective that you do of the years in the 60s when, when the sport was still growing and your perspective coming from New England and Boston and then overlapping with everyone in New York and just having that mesh happen. And I find it fascinating. All the names, the big names of both New York and Boston that worked together to help grow our sport. And, everyone from Ted uh, to Fred to everybody in New England. Look at where we are now. You can't even get in a race.
Well, it was an incredibly exciting time because there was the word we've always used is boom, this growth period from the mid 70s, and it came from nowhere. Nobody expected it. Nobody expected that there were going to be shoe companies making money and drink companies like Gatorade and fuel companies, and now the list goes on and on and on of the companies involved in the sport of running, the watch companies and the online companies. Nobody foresaw this. Nobody ever foresaw runners getting paid $100,000 or $500,000 to compete in a marathon. So to be part of that boom from the mid 70s onward, I don't think there can ever be a time quite as exciting as that because there was so much going on and it came from nowhere. There's a lot going on now, and this is a really exciting period now with sub 2 hour marathoners and women running incredibly fast times and age group masters runners running incredibly fast times. But it comes from a very high level, from a high beginning point. So the growth isn't quite as exciting now as it was back in the time when it took off.
Well, that's why we need people like you, Hal Higdon, Tom Derderian, Catherine Switzer, everyone who writes about our sport, Roger Robinson, to preserve the past and bring us to the future. So, for everything you do, I want to thank you.
Well, thank you, Gail. It's been fun talking to you about these subjects so near and dear, close to our hearts. And it would be absolutely wonderful if a few people become interested in the history of running and where we started and how we got to where we are now.
Well, that's our job, and I think we're doing a good job with it. All
I did too.
right. Well, thank you, Amby.
Thanks, Gail.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stop. Re-